My name is Sarah Adler, and I fell in love in a place where love should have been impossible. I fell in love in darkness, in silence, in a space so small that two people could barely stand side by side. I fell in love while the world outside searched for me, while death waited at every door, while my very existence was a crime punishable by horrors I cannot speak. This is the story of how music saved my life, how a lie became the most honest thing I ever lived, and how love can bloom even in the smallest, darkest places when two souls refuse to let the darkness win. I was born in Vienna in 1920, the only child of Jakob and Miriam Adler. My father was a violin maker, one of the finest in Austria, and my mother was a pianist who had once performed in the great concert halls of Europe before she married. Music was the language of our home, more fundamental than German or the Yiddish my grandparents spoke. I learned to play violin before I learned to read, my father's patient hands guiding mine across the strings, teaching me that music was not just sound, but emotion made tangible, soul made audible. By the time I was 16, I was performing with the Vienna Youth Orchestra, being called a prodigy, receiving invitations to audition for conservatories across Europe. My father would sit in the audience during my performances, tears streaming down his face, so proud he could barely contain it. My mother would tell me I had a gift, a responsibility to share beauty with a world that desperately needed it. I believed her. I believed that music could transcend everything, that art was a universal language that could unite people across any divide. Then came 1938. The Anschluss, German troops marching into Austria, swastika flags appearing overnight on buildings that had stood for centuries. New laws, new restrictions, new definitions of who was human and who was not. Jews were no longer Austrian. Jews were no longer citizens. Jews were no longer welcome in orchestras or concert halls or any public space. Jews were no longer safe. My father's shop was destroyed in November 1938 during Kristallnacht. They smashed every violin he had crafted over decades, trampled on the delicate instruments that represented his life's work, burned his tools and wood and patterns. My father stood in the ruins and wept, and I understood then that something had broken in the world that could never be repaired, that the people doing this were beyond the reach of music or reason or any appeal to shared humanity. We fled Vienna in 1939, using money my mother had hidden, crossing borders with forged papers, moving from city to city across Europe as the German advance followed us like a shadow. Prague, then Warsaw, then Paris. Always running, always one step ahead of the laws and the camps and the trains that took people to places they never returned from. My violin came with me, the only possession we managed to save, a guarneri my father had made for my 15th birthday. It was worth a fortune, but I would have starved before I sold it. It was the last piece of my father's art that existed in the world. We were in Paris when the Germans arrived in 1940. We watched from our tiny apartment as the Wehrmacht marched down the Champs-Élysées, as the swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower, as our refuge became another occupied territory. My father wanted to flee again, to try for Spain or Switzerland, but my mother was ill by then, weak from years of stress and poor nutrition and the constant fear. She couldn't make another journey. So we stayed, moved to an even smaller apartment in the Marais, wore the yellow stars we were required to wear, tried to become invisible. My father was arrested in 1941, taken during a roundup in our neighborhood. They said he would be sent to a work camp in the east, that he would be fine if he worked hard and caused no trouble. We never heard from him again. My mother died 3 months later, of pneumonia officially, but really of a broken heart. She simply gave up, closed her eyes one night and didn't open them again. I was 21 years old and completely alone in an occupied city that wanted me dead. I survived by hiding, by moving from place to place, by relying on the kindness of strangers who risked everything to shelter me for a night or a week. I learned to recognize safe houses by subtle signs, learned to move through the city at times when patrols were sparse, learned to eat scraps and sleep in cellars and disappear into crowds. I kept my violin with me always, wrapped in cloth, hidden under my coat. It was foolish. Carrying something so valuable and distinctive made me more vulnerable, but I couldn't abandon it. It was the last connection to my parents, to the life we had lived, to the person I had been before the world went mad. In the winter of 1942, I was betrayed. I had been staying in a boarding house run by a widow who claimed to be sympathetic to Jews. She took my money and my ration cards, and then she reported me to the authorities. I fled moments before the Gestapo arrived, running through frozen streets with nothing but my violin and the clothes on my back, knowing that every door might be closed to me, that I might freeze to death before morning. I found myself in a residential neighborhood in the 16th arrondissement, desperately knocking on doors, begging for help. Most wouldn't even open their doors. Those who did took one look at me, filthy, terrified, obviously Jewish despite having removed my star, and slammed the door in my face. I was ready to give up, ready to find a doorway to curl up in and accept whatever came, when one final door opened. The man who answered was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair and exhausted eyes. He was wearing a doctor's coat over civilian clothes, clearly just returned from work. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of compassion against risk, of moral duty against self-preservation. Then he glanced down at the violin case in my arms, and something in his expression shifted. "Quickly," he said in French, pulling me inside, "before someone sees." His name was Etienne Beaumont, and he saved my life that night in more ways than one. He brought me into his family's home, a large townhouse that had belonged to his grandparents, where he lived with his mother, Marguerite, and his younger sister, Claire. He explained my situation in rapid whispers while I stood shivering in the entrance hall. A Jewish woman fleeing the Gestapo, nowhere else to go. He asked if they would help. Marguerite Beaumont was a formidable woman, elegant even in her middle age, with steel in her spine that the occupation hadn't bent. She looked at me for a long moment, then at the violin case, then back at me. She asked if I could play. I nodded. She said that anyone who carried an instrument through hell deserved a chance at salvation. Then she led me to the attic. The attic was not large, perhaps 4 meters by 3, with a sloped ceiling that made it impossible to stand upright, except in the very center. It had been used for storage, filled with old furniture and boxes and the accumulated debris of generations. Marguerite and Etienne cleared a space in one corner, brought up a mattress and blankets, a chamber pot, a small table and chair. "This would be my home," they said. "I could not leave it, could not make noise during the day when neighbors might hear, could not exist in any way that might alert anyone to my presence. I would be a ghost in their attic, a secret they would keep at the risk of their own lives." I wept with gratitude. They were risking everything, their lives, their home, their safety for a stranger. If I was discovered, they would all be arrested, possibly executed. It was an act of extraordinary courage and compassion, the kind of goodness that gives you faith in humanity, even as the world demonstrates its capacity for evil. The first weeks were the hardest. The isolation was crushing, the silence oppressive. I could hear the family moving below me, living their lives, while I existed in limbo above them. During the day I could not move, could barely breathe loudly, certainly could not play my violin. I sat in that cramped space, watching dust motes drift through the thin light from a small window, and tried not to go mad from the confinement. Etienne would visit me each evening after he returned from the hospital where he worked. He would bring me food, empty the chamber pot, bring fresh water. At first our interactions were brief and practical. He would check that I was well, make sure I had everything I needed, then leave me alone. But gradually we began to talk. Whispered conversations in the darkness, him sitting on the floor by the attic entrance, me huddled on my mattress in the corner. He told me about his work at the hospital, about the wounded and sick he treated, about the impossible choices he faced every day, which patients to help when supplies were scarce, how to treat German soldiers who had been ordered to the hospital while French resistance fighters bled out in the streets. He told me about his father, who'd been killed in the first months of the war, about the responsibility he felt as the man of the family, about his fear that he wasn't strong enough, wise enough, good enough to protect his mother and sister. I told him about Vienna, about my parents, about the music that had filled our home. I told him about the concerts I had performed, the dreams I had nurtured, the future I had imagined before everything was stolen. I told him about the guilt I felt for surviving when so many hadn't, about the nightmares that woke me silently screaming, about the constant fear that scratched at my mind like rats in the walls. We developed a routine over those early months. Every evening, Etienne would come to the attic, and we would talk for an hour, sometimes two. He became my connection to the world beyond my prison, my reminder that life continued despite everything. And I became something for him too, though I didn't understand what until much later. I was someone he could be honest with, someone who existed outside the roles he had to play: dutiful son, responsible doctor, strong protector. With me, in the darkness of that attic, he could simply be Etienne, afraid and uncertain, and doing his best in impossible circumstances. One evening, 3 months after I arrived, Etienne asked if I would play my violin for him. I explained that I couldn't. The sound would carry, neighbors would hear, we would all be discovered. He said he had been thinking about that, had an idea. The attic had thick walls, and if I played quietly, late at night when the neighbors were asleep, with blankets hung to muffle the sound, perhaps it would be safe, just for a few minutes, just so I could remember who I had been before I became a ghost. I was terrified to try. Every instinct screamed that making any sound was dangerous, that music would be my death sentence. But I also desperately needed to play. My fingers ached for the strings. My soul starved for the expression that only music could provide. So that night, with blankets hung over the window and Etienne standing guard by the stairs, I played for the first time in months. I chose Bach, the chaconne from the Partita in D minor. It's a piece about loss and grief and transcendence, about finding beauty in sorrow, about the human capacity to create meaning from suffering. My fingers were stiff at first, clumsy from disuse, but muscle memory took over. The music poured out of me, all the fear and grief and longing I had been holding inside, channeled through strings and wood and the vibrations of sound. When I finished, there were tears on my cheeks. I looked up to find Etienne standing at the top of the stairs, frozen, his face transformed by emotion I couldn't quite read. He whispered that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard, that I had given him a gift beyond measure. Then he left quickly, and I didn't see him again until the next evening. Playing became a ritual after that. 2 or 3 times a week, late at night, Etienne would signal that it was safe, and I would play for him. Just him. Private concerts in a cramped attic, performing for an audience of one. I played everything I had memorized: Bach and Vivaldi, Mozart and Beethoven, Brahms and Tchaikovsky. I played the pieces my father had loved, the melodies my mother had accompanied on piano. I played my history, my grief, my hope, and Etienne listened as if each note was precious, as if I was giving him something sacred. We began to talk more during those sessions between pieces. I would tell him about the music, about the composers and their lives, about what each piece meant to me. He would tell me about his day, about the patients he had saved and the ones he had lost, about the small acts of resistance he witnessed, about the moments of humanity that persisted despite the occupation. Our conversations deepened, became more personal, more intimate. We talked about philosophy and religion, about art and science, about our dreams for the future if we survived this nightmare. I fell in love with him gradually, so slowly that I didn't realize it was happening until it had already happened. It started with gratitude, evolved into friendship, deepened into something I couldn't name. I loved the way he listened when I spoke, the way he looked at me as if I mattered, as if my thoughts and feelings and existence had value in a world that had declared me worthless. I loved his gentleness, his strength, his willingness to risk everything for what was right. I loved the sound of his voice in the darkness, the warmth of his presence in my cold prison, the way he made me feel human when everything else tried to reduce me to something less. But I said nothing. How could I? He was risking his life to hide me. Any expression of romantic feeling would be a terrible burden, would complicate an already impossible situation, would force him to respond to something he might not feel. So I kept my love secret, locked it away with all the other things I couldn't express, and tried to be content with the friendship we had. It was Etienne who broke the silence, 9 months after I arrived. We had been talking late one night, after I had played Massenet's Meditation from Thais, a piece so achingly beautiful that it had left us both emotional. He told me he needed to confess something, that he had been keeping a secret that was becoming unbearable. I tensed, terrified that he was going to tell me I had to leave, that the risk had become too great. that I was no longer welcome. Instead, he told me he loved me. He said he had been fighting it for months, trying to convince himself it was just compassion or friendship, or the strange intimacy of our circumstances, but he couldn't deny it anymore. He was in love with me, with my courage, my music, my mind, my soul. He loved me despite the impossibility of it, despite the 1,000 reasons it was foolish and dangerous and hopeless. He loved me, and he needed me to know, even if I couldn't love him back, even if nothing could ever come of it. I started crying. I told him I loved him too, had loved him for months, had been terrified to say anything. We sat there in the darkness, both of us crying and laughing and overcome with the relief of mutual confession. Then Etienne climbed the stairs fully into the attic, crossed the small space between us and kissed me. It was the gentlest kiss imaginable, tender and careful and full of reverence, as if I was something precious that might break. When we pulled apart, he apologized, said he shouldn't have done that I was vulnerable and dependent on him and he had no right. I stopped him by kissing him again, harder this time, with all the pent-up longing and need and love I had been holding back. We became lovers that spring. Our physical relationship developed slowly, constrained by the circumstances and the constant need for silence. We couldn't make noise, couldn't move freely, couldn't express our passion in normal ways. Everything was whispered and muffled and carefully controlled, but that constraint made every touch more precious, every kiss more intense, every moment of intimacy a defiant act against the forces trying to destroy us. Etienne would come to the attic late at night, after his mother and sister were asleep, and we would hold each other in the darkness, talking and kissing and making love with a quietness that was its own form of music. We created our own world in that tiny space, a world where the war didn't exist, where I wasn't hunted, where we were simply two people who loved each other. Those hours were the only times I felt truly alive, truly human, truly hopeful that we might survive this and build a real life together. But reality always intruded. By the summer of 1943, the occupation had become more brutal, more desperate. The Germans were losing in Russia, retreating in North Africa, beginning to realize that they might not win this war. That realization made them more vicious, more determined to complete their genocidal mission before time ran out. The roundups intensified. More Jews were arrested and deported. More collaborators emerged, eager to profit from betrayal. The danger grew every day. Etienne began to worry that hiding me in the attic was no longer enough. The Gestapo had started conducting more thorough searches of houses, looking for hidden Jews and resistance members. If they searched his home, they would find me. His mother and sister would be arrested, possibly executed. He couldn't let that happen. He developed a plan. He would marry me. With a marriage certificate, I would legally be Madame Sarah Beaumont, a French woman married to a French doctor, beyond suspicion. We would need forged papers showing I wasn't Jewish, a fabricated history that would withstand scrutiny. It would be difficult and dangerous to arrange, but it was safer than continuing as we were. I told him it was too risky, that forging marriage documents would put him in even more danger. He said the danger was already enormous, and at least this way we would have legal protection if something went wrong. Besides, he added with a small smile, he wanted to marry me anyway. We might as well make it official, even if the circumstances were less than romantic. Etienne had a friend, Dr. Philippe Laurent, who worked in the hospital administration and had connections to the resistance. Philippe was willing to help for a price. He could create documents showing that I was Sarah Martin, born in Brittany to Catholic parents who had died in a car accident in 1938. He could backdate a marriage certificate showing Etienne and I had married in a small civil ceremony in 1941, before the stricter registration requirements were implemented. He could even create baptismal records and school documents if needed. It would take time and money, but it could be done. We spent weeks preparing. Etienne sold some family silver to pay Philippe. I memorized my new identity, where I was supposedly born, where I went to school, the names of my fictitious parents and grandparents, the story of how Etienne and I had met. We prepared responses to every question that might be asked, rehearsed our story until it was flawless. And we waited, terrified, for Philippe to deliver the documents that would either save us or condemn us. The papers arrived in August 1943. They were perfect. Official stamps, proper signatures, aged to look authentic. Philippe had done extraordinary work. Etienne and I were now legally married, had been for 2 years according to the documents, and I had a completely French identity with nothing to link me to my Jewish past. But having the papers wasn't enough. I needed to emerge from hiding gradually, carefully, in a way that wouldn't raise suspicion. We decided on a story. I had been living with relatives in the south, in unoccupied France, and had just returned to Paris to be with my husband. I would start appearing in public with Etienne, shopping at markets, attending church, becoming known in the neighborhood. We would build a visible life that matched our papers. The first time I left the attic after 13 months of confinement, I nearly collapsed. The world outside was overwhelming, too bright, too loud, too vast. My legs were weak from inactivity, my eyes unaccustomed to daylight. Etienne had to support me as we walked down the stairs, through the house, out the front door into sunlight that felt like fire on my skin. We walked slowly through the neighborhood, arm in arm, acting like any married couple out for a stroll. I was terrified every moment, certain that someone would recognize me as Jewish, that my false papers would be exposed, that the Gestapo would appear and drag me away. But nothing happened. People nodded politely. Shopkeepers greeted Etienne. Neighbors commented on what a lovely couple we made. I was invisible in a new way, not hidden but disguised, protected by papers and performance, and the assumption that a woman walking openly with a French doctor couldn't possibly be one of the hunted. Over the following weeks, I gradually built a life outside the attic. I helped Marguerite with household tasks, shopped for groceries with my ration cards, attended Mass at the local church every Sunday. I learned to smile and chat with neighbors, to complain about food shortages and the occupation like everyone else, to be unremarkable in every way. It was its own kind of performance, exhausting in a different way than hiding had been, but necessary for survival. Etienne and I settled into married life, or at least the appearance of it. We shared his bedroom now, slept in the same bed, lived as husband and wife in every way. His mother and sister knew the truth, that the marriage was for protection, that I was Jewish, that the whole thing was an elaborate deception. But they treated me as family anyway, with warmth and acceptance that made me love them as much as I loved Etienne. I still played violin, but differently now. I could play during the day, in the parlor, with windows open. I played at church services, at small gatherings Marguerite hosted, at the hospital where Etienne worked to entertain patients. My music was no longer secret, no longer dangerous. It was a gift I could share openly, and sharing it made me feel human again, reminded me that I was more than just a survivor, that I had value beyond mere existence. The war ground on. 1943 became 1944. The Allies invaded Italy, then France. We heard reports of liberation, of German retreats, of the tide finally turning. Hope began to cautiously emerge, the possibility that we might actually survive this, that France might be free, that I might have a future beyond fear and hiding. But with hope came new dangers. As the Germans realized they were losing, they became more desperate, more brutal. The resistance grew bolder, sabotaging infrastructure, assassinating collaborators, preparing for liberation. And the reprisals were savage. Entire villages destroyed, hundreds executed for the actions of a few. Paris became a powder keg, everyone waiting for the explosion that would either free us or consume us. In June 1944, as Allied forces fought through Normandy, the Gestapo began a new wave of searches in Paris, looking for resistance members and hidden Jews in a last desperate attempt to complete their mission. They arrived at the Beaumont house on a Tuesday morning, 8 soldiers and a Gestapo officer, demanding to search the premises. Etienne was at work. It was just Marguerite, Claire and me when they came. I was in the parlor practicing a sonata when I heard the pounding on the door. Marguerite answered, her voice calm and dignified as she asked what they wanted. They pushed past her, spreading through the house, overturning furniture, searching every room. I stood frozen in the parlor, violin still in my hands as a young German soldier entered. He looked at me, at the violin, at the music stand with its scattered sheets. He asked in broken French who I was. I told him I was Madame Beaumont, that this was my home, that I would appreciate it if they would be more careful with our belongings. My voice was steady despite the terror coursing through me. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my mind, prepared for the day when my false identity would be tested. He asked for my papers. I set down my violin carefully and retrieved them from the desk drawer. Marriage certificate, identification card, baptismal record, everything Philippa had forged. The soldier studied them, looked at me, looked back at the documents. I could see him calculating, looking for inconsistencies, for the telltale signs that marked someone as Jewish. So I knew what he was looking for. The features that had been caricatured in propaganda, the stereotypes that had been drilled into him. I stared back at him calmly, my heart pounding but my face serene, everything depending on his decision. Finally, he handed the papers back. He said they looked in order. Then he asked about the attic. My blood turned to ice. I told him it was storage, nothing interesting, just old furniture and boxes. He said they needed to check anyway. I led him up the stairs, through the house to the attic entrance, my mind racing through possibilities. Would they find something that gave me away? Some remnant of my 13 months hiding there? Some evidence that would expose everything? The soldier climbed into the attic, spent 5 minutes moving boxes and checking corners. I stood at the entrance, Marguerite beside me, both of us barely breathing. Finally, he climbed back down, said there was nothing suspicious, and left to check other rooms. The search continued for another hour, but they found nothing. Eventually, they left, warning that they would return if they had any reason to suspect resistance activity. When they were gone, when we were certain they wouldn't return immediately, I collapsed. All the fear I had held back poured out in shaking and tears and gasps for air. Marguerite held me while I fell apart, whispering that I was safe, that it was over, that I had been so brave. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over as long as the occupation continued, as long as my very existence was a crime. Etienne came home to find me still shaking, still terrified despite the danger having passed. He held me tight, told me he was so proud of how I had handled it, that my courage had saved us all. But he was worried too. The Gestapo had our address now, had documentation that they had searched the house. If they had any reason to return, if any doubt about me arose, we would be under immediate suspicion. We needed to be more careful than ever. The summer of 1944 was agony. Liberation was so close. We could hear the artillery in the distance, could see German troops preparing defenses, could feel the tension in the city as everyone waited for the final confrontation. But close didn't mean safe. The Germans were still here, still dangerous, still conducting searches and arrests and executions. Every day we survived was a miracle. Every day we woke up still free felt like borrowed time. The uprising began on August 19th. The Parisian resistance rose against the occupation, building barricades, attacking German positions, seizing key buildings. The city erupted into warfare, street by street, block by block. The Germans fought back viciously, shelling buildings, executing prisoners, determined not to surrender Paris without extracting maximum blood. Etienne was called to the hospital around the clock, treating wounded fighters from both sides, working until he collapsed from exhaustion. I stayed home with Marguerite and Claire, listening to gunfire and explosions, not knowing if Etienne was safe, if the house would be hit, if liberation would come before we were all killed. We had survived so much, come so far. It seemed impossibly cruel that we might die now, just days before freedom. The Germans surrendered on August 25th. General de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées. Paris was free. The occupation was over. We had survived. I played my violin that day, standing in the street outside our house, playing the Marseillaise while people cheered and cried and embraced. I played for my parents, who hadn't survived to see this day. I played for all the people who had been murdered, who had died in camps and ghettos and mass graves. I played for Etienne and Marguerite and Claire, who had risked everything to save me. And I played for myself, for the person I had been and the person I had become, for the music that had kept me alive when everything else tried to kill me. In the months after liberation, the truth of what had happened during the occupation emerged. The camps were discovered, the scope of the genocide revealed. 6 million Jews murdered, my parents among them. I learned later that my father had died in Auschwitz in 1942. My mother's death certificate listed the same camp. They had both been murdered while I hid in an attic, while I fell in love, while I played music in the darkness. The guilt was crushing. Why had I survived when they hadn't? What made me special, more deserving of life? I had done nothing heroic, nothing extraordinary. I had simply been lucky enough to knock on the right door, to find people brave enough to risk everything for a stranger. And that luck, that accident of fate, meant I lived while millions died. Etienne helped me through the worst of the guilt, the survivor's anguish that threatened to destroy me even after the physical danger had passed. He reminded me that surviving wasn't a betrayal of the dead, that living fully and completely was the best way to honor their memory. He told me that my music, my joy, my love, all of it was an act of defiance against the forces that had tried to eliminate me and everyone like me. We faced a decision in those months after liberation. Our marriage was based on forged documents, created under duress, never intended to be permanent. We could annul it, go our separate ways, both free to build new lives without the weight of the deception that had bound us together. Many couples in similar situations chose that path, acknowledging that relationships born in crisis rarely survived peace. But we didn't want that. What had started as a survival strategy had become real. I loved Etienne, not because he had saved me or because I was grateful, but because of who he was, his kindness, his courage, his gentle strength. And he loved me, not as a rescue project or a wartime romance, but as a partner, an equal, a woman he wanted to build a life with. So we married again, properly this time. A real wedding with a real priest, our real names, no deception or forgery. Just two people who loved each other, choosing to make that love official before God and community. Marguerite cried through the entire ceremony. Claire was my maid of honor. And when the priest pronounced us husband and wife, when Etienne kissed me in front of everyone, I felt truly married for the first time, truly committed, truly free to love without fear. We built a good life together in the decades that followed. Etienne continued working as a doctor, eventually opening a small clinic that treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. I returned to music, teaching violin to children, performing in small venues, never achieving the international career I had once dreamed of, but finding deep satisfaction in sharing music with others. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up in a France still recovering from war but slowly healing, slowly rebuilding. I told our children everything when they were old enough to understand. I told them about the attic, about the forged papers, about the 13 months I spent as a ghost in their grandparents' home. I told them about their Jewish heritage, about the grandparents they would never meet, about the millions who had been murdered for the crime of existing. And I told them about love, about how their father had saved me in every way possible, about how music and courage and compassion had made survival possible. Etienne died in 1998 after 54 years of marriage. He was 79, had lived a full life, had seen his children and grandchildren grow, had made the world measurably better through his work and his kindness. But losing him was like losing a part of myself, the part that had been forged in that attic, that had learned to love in darkness, that had survived impossible circumstances through his protection and devotion. I'm 96 years old now, living in the same house where I once hid, where I fell in love, where I learned that humanity persists even in the darkest times. The attic is still there, though we converted it to a proper room decades ago. Sometimes I sit up there and remember those months of confinement, the terror and boredom and desperate hope. And I remember the music, the whispered conversations, the gentle touch of a man who saw me as human when the world declared me less than human. I still play violin, though my fingers are no longer as nimble, though arthritis makes the long sessions impossible. But I play for myself, for Etienne's memory, for the parents I lost, for the millions who were silenced. I play because music saved my life, because it was the bridge between who I was and who I became, because it proved that beauty could exist even in hell. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry, if I hate the Germans, if the trauma of those years destroyed something essential in me. I tell them the truth. Yes, I'm angry. Yes, I carry scars that never fully healed. Yes, there are nightmares I still wake from, moments of panic when I hear German spoken or see a uniform. But I also carry love. I carry the memory of people who risked everything to save me, who chose compassion over fear, who proved that evil never has the final word as long as good people refuse to remain silent. Etienne once told me, near the end of his life, that hiding me had been the most important thing he ever did, more important than any life he saved as a doctor, any good he accomplished in his career. I told him he was wrong. He had done so much good, helped so many people, but he insisted. He said that choosing to open that door the night I knocked, choosing to risk everything for a stranger, had defined him, had made him the person he wanted to be. Love, he said, was the only thing that mattered in the end. Everything else was just details. I believe him. Love is what saved me. Not just Etienne's love, though that was the foundation, but also Marguerite's maternal love, Claire's sisterly acceptance, Philippe's brave assistance, the love of music that kept me sane, the love of life that refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed rational. Love in all its forms, defying a world built on hatred, proving that light survives even when darkness seems absolute. This is my story. This is my testimony. This is the song I played in the darkness and the love that carried me through. I am Sarah Adler Beaumont, daughter of murdered parents, survivor of genocide, wife of a hero, mother and grandmother, violinist and teacher, a woman who learned that the smallest spaces can contain the deepest love, that music speaks when words fail, that courage is found in the everyday choice to remain human despite forces trying to reduce us to less. And I am still here, still playing, still loving, still defying with every breath and every note the hatred that tried to silence me forever. The music continues. Love endures. And that, in the end, is how we win. The end.